Picture this: you step into the grand hall of a medieval castle, the air thick with the scent of candle wax and expensive perfumes. All around you, the nobility moves in a dazzling display of deep purples, rich scarlets, and gleaming golds. But here's the thing, those colors weren't just for show. Every single hue was a carefully crafted message, a visual code that screamed power, wealth, and divine right to rule. In the medieval world, color wasn't just decoration, it was a language, a weapon, and a shield all rolled into one. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on that world, uncovering the secrets behind the most powerful shades in history. Think about the last time you put on a favorite outfit, maybe a sharp black suit for a job interview or a bright red dress for a night out. Without realizing it, you were tapping into a tradition that goes back centuries, where colors spoke louder than words. But in the Middle Ages, the stakes were even higher. Wearing the wrong shade could land you in prison, or worse. Kings and queens didn't just wear purple because it looked nice. They wore it because it was a monopoly, a color so expensive and rare that only the highest ranks could afford it. The same went for the fiery reds flaunted by nobles, the celestial blues reserved for royalty, and the shimmering golds that whispered of divine approval. These weren't fashion choices, they were power plays. So why does this matter to us today? Because these medieval color codes never really disappeared. They evolved, seeped into our modern world, and still shape the way we see authority, luxury, and even rebellion. When a CEO wears a crisp white shirt or a graduation robe drips in crimson, they're unknowingly echoing a tradition that began in throne rooms and cathedrals centuries ago. This video isn't just a history lesson, it's a key to decoding the hidden messages in the colors all around us. We'll trace the origins of these symbolic shades, from the snail-derived dyes that bankrupted empires to the sumptuary laws that dictated who could wear what. You'll never look at a color the same way again, so let's step into the vibrant, ruthless world of medieval power, where every thread told a story and the right color could make or break a ruler. In medieval Europe, color was never just a matter of personal taste. It was a carefully calculated system of meaning, shaped by forces far beyond the dye vat. Take something as simple as a blue robe. To us, it might seem like a fashion choice, but in the Middle Ages, that exact shade could tell you whether the wearer was a humble laborer or a bishop with connections to distant trade routes. The roots of this symbolism ran deep, tangled in three powerful forces: religion, economics, and sheer human ingenuity. First, consider the divine connections. The church didn't just use color, it sanctified it. Blue, extracted from rare lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan, became inseparable from depictions of the Virgin Mary by the 12th century. Wearing it wasn't just about beauty, it was a visual prayer, a way to align oneself with heavenly grace. Similarly, white, often achieved through labor-intensive bleaching processes, symbolized purity precisely because keeping it pristine required wealth and servants. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were theological statements woven into fabric. Then there was the economics of exclusivity. Producing vibrant, long-lasting dyes was a feat of medieval science and exploitation. That coveted Tyrian purple, it took thousands of crushed Mediterranean sea snails to dye a single cloak, a process so noxious that dye workshops were often banished to the outskirts of towns. The staggering cost, some sources claim it was worth 3 times its weight in gold, meant only emperors and popes could afford it. Even less extravagant colors like rich reds, derived from painstakingly harvested kermes insects, cost a fortune. When you saw someone in scarlet, you weren't just seeing a color, you were seeing a walking ledger of their wealth. But perhaps the most fascinating layer was how global trade transformed Europe's color palette. Crusaders returning from the East brought back not just spices and silks, but also vibrant dyes like saffron yellow and indigo. These imports didn't just add new hues, they reshaped social hierarchies. Suddenly, a merchant who'd never set foot in a royal court could flaunt a cloak dyed with Eastern indigo, subtly challenging the old order. The colors of power weren't static, they evolved with every ship that docked in Venice or Constantinople. What emerges from this tapestry of influences is a startling truth. Medieval color symbolism was never just about aesthetics. It was a language, one where every shade carried the weight of scripture, the spark of far-off lands, and the unspoken rules of who mattered in society. And as we'll see next, those rules weren't just cultural. They were written into law with terrifying consequences. Imagine living in a world where the color of your cloak could land you in jail. That was the reality of medieval Europe, where sumptuary laws turned fashion into a rigid class system enforced by royal decree. These weren't just suggestions. They were meticulously detailed rules specifying everything from the width of a merchant's sleeve trim to the exact shade of red a countess could wear. A butcher's wife caught wearing ermine fur or a wealthy trader sporting gold embroidery might face confiscation of their finery, hefty fines, or even public humiliation in the stocks. At their core, these laws served one purpose: to make social rank instantly visible. In an era before identification cards or uniform insignia, color became society's barcode. Kings understood that if a banker's wife could dress like a duchess, the entire feudal order might unravel. Take England's 1433 statute. It decreed that only those with an annual income over £100 could wear imported velvet. That's equivalent to nearly $500,000 today, an impossible sum for most. Even the width of fabric stripes was regulated, with nobles permitted broader bands than commoners. But the most fiercely guarded colors were those tied to royal authority. In Venice, the penalty for wearing Tyrian purple without permission wasn't just a fine, it was execution. Florence went further, appointing special fashion police, called the officially del Pomp, to inspect citizens' wardrobes. Their records reveal cases like a silk merchant forced to remove silver buttons from his doublet because metal threads were reserved for knights. These weren't arbitrary crackdowns. They were calculated moves to maintain what sociologists now call conspicuous inequality, the deliberate flaunting of unattainable luxuries to reinforce hierarchy. The psychological impact was profound. When a peasant saw their lord riding past in crimson-dyed wool, they weren't just seeing wealth, they were seeing a walking embodiment of divinely ordained superiority. This visual conditioning worked so well that even when sumptuary laws weakened during the Black Death as labor shortages made dyes more accessible, many commoners still avoided noble colors out of ingrained habit. The elite's monopoly wasn't just about materials, it was about manufacturing consent through color. What makes these laws particularly fascinating is their global reach. From Japan's Edo period, edicts banning commoners from wearing saffron yellow to Islamic caliphates restricting green, believed to be the prophet's favorite color, cultures worldwide weaponized hue hierarchies. This universality suggests something deeper than medieval eccentricity. It reveals color's primal power as a social signal. Even today, when we instinctively recognize a navy suit as corporate or associate white coats with medical authority, we're channeling this ancient instinct to equate color with control. Yet cracks began appearing in this chromatic caste system. As medieval markets expanded, clever merchants exploited loopholes. like lining cloaks with forbidden colors or using cheaper imitations. In 15th century Bruges, dyers developed Kermes Light, a diluted scarlet that technically complied with laws while still conveying status. These subtle acts of rebellion previewed a coming revolution, where economic clout would eventually outweigh hereditary privilege in determining who got to wear what. But before that shift could occur, one color would remain stubbornly out of reach: the legendary purple worn by emperors. Tyrian purple wasn't just a color, it was alchemy turned into power. Picture ancient dye workers along the Phoenician coast, harvesting thousands of spiny murex snails from rocky shores. Each mollusk secreted mere drops of a yellowish liquid that, when exposed to sunlight, transformed into that legendary deep violet hue. The process was revolting, rotting shellfish carcasses piled high, emitting a stench so foul that dye workshops were isolated outside city walls. But the result? A shade so radiant it seemed to glow from within, as if woven from twilight itself. This wasn't merely expensive, it was logistically staggering. Historians estimate it took 12,000 snails to produce just 1 gram of dye, enough for the trim of a single garment. By the 4th century, a pound of Tyrian purple will cost 3 times a laborer's annual wages. No wonder Roman emperors like Diocletian fixed its price in their edict on maximum prices, trying and failing to curb its astronomical value. When Byzantine Empress Theodora draped herself in purple silks, she wasn't just wearing fabric, she was displaying an empire's wealth on her shoulders. The color's mystique went beyond cost. Early Christians adopted it for clerical vestments, linking it to Christ's royal lineage. Byzantine emperors took this further. They built an actual porphyra chamber in Constantinople's great palace, lined with purple stone, where empresses gave birth. Children born here were literally porphyrogenitoi, born in the purple. Their legitimacy died into their identity. What's fascinating is how this snail-derived hue outlasted empires. When Constantinople fell in 1453, Ottoman sultans claimed the purple mantle for themselves. Centuries later, Renaissance popes still wore it to signal continuity with ancient glory. Even today, traces linger the royal purple in modern playing cards, a distant echo of those Mediterranean mollusks that once colored the robes of kings. But while purple reigned supreme, another color was rising, one that would come to symbolize both the splendor and brutality of medieval power. If purple was the shade of divine right, red would become the color of blood and nobility. Scarlet and crimson weren't just colors in the medieval world. They were liquid power, extracted drop by drop from the crushed bodies of tiny insects. To wear these fiery hues was to declare your place at the top of the social pyramid, but also to carry the weight of their darker symbolism. The most coveted reds came from Kermes, scale insects harvested from oak trees around the Mediterranean. It took 70,000 of these creatures to produce 1 pound of dye, making scarlet wool more valuable by weight than most spices. When a noblewoman swept through a castle hall in her Kermes dyed gown, she wasn't just wearing fabric, she was draping herself in the equivalent of a peasant village's annual income. Yet red's significance went far beyond wealth. On the battlefield, crimson cloaks and banners served a psychological purpose. They hid bloodstains while projecting unshakable courage. Warriors knew a knight splattered with gore looked terrifying, but one whose red garb showed no weakness, that was a legend in the making. The color became so associated with martial prowess that by the 1400s, mercenary companies like the infamous White Company specifically avoided red uniforms. They wanted enemies to see every wound they inflicted, making their reputation even more fearsome. The church recognized red's potent symbolism too, adopting it for cardinals' robes as early as the 1200s. This wasn't just about visibility, It tied these powerful clergymen to the blood of martyrs and the fires of Pentecost. A cardinal's crimson had told the faithful, "This man stands ready to die for his beliefs." Ironically, the same hue that decorated saints' feast days also adorned executioners' hoods, a chilling reminder of color's ability to mean opposite things in different contexts. What makes medieval reds particularly fascinating is their chemical ingenuity. Unlike purple, which faded to dull brown over time, Kermes dye bonded so tightly with wool that tapestries dyed 800 years ago still blaze with color today. Dyers' guilds guarded their recipes fiercely, sometimes adding iron-rich compounds to create deeper crimsons or alum mordants for brighter scarlets. These weren't just craftsmen, they were medieval chemists manipulating molecules before the periodic table existed. The social theater surrounding these colors reached absurd heights. In 15th century Florence, wealthy families would literally compete to see whose wedding could display the most scarlet drapery, sometimes bankrupting themselves in the process. Meanwhile, sumptuary laws nervously dictated that only certain ranks could wear certain shades. Venice's 1492 code allowed senators to wear deep crimson, but merchants had to settle for murrey, a cheaper purple-red blend. These distinctions might seem petty today, but in a world without photography or mass media, controlling who could wear what color was as crucial as controlling the press. Red's dual nature, luxury and violence, sacred and profane, made it the ultimate medieval status symbol. It whispered of silk roads and crusader battles, of martyrs' blood and banking fortunes. A single bolt of scarlet cloth could tell you more about a person's power than their family name or land holdings. And as we'll soon discover, another color was quietly waiting in the wings, about to make an astonishing leap from obscurity to royal obsession. Early medieval Europe barely noticed blue. It was the color of peasant work clothes, dyed with cheap woad plants that produced dull, muddy hues. But everything changed when crusaders and merchants began bringing back chunks of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan's remote Sar Isang mines. This striking blue stone, flecked with golden pyrite like a night sky full of stars, became the source of ultramarine, literally beyond the sea pigment. Ground into powder and mixed with binding agents, it created a blue so vivid it seemed to glow from within. Suddenly, blue wasn't just another color, it was a miracle. The church played a pivotal role in blue's transformation. Before the 1200s, artists typically depicted the Virgin Mary in somber, dark robes. But as lapis lazuli began arriving via Venetian trade routes, theologians seized on its celestial brilliance to reframe her iconography. By the 13th century, Mary's cloak blazed ultramarine in illuminated manuscripts and stained glass, visually linking her to heaven's purity. This wasn't just artistic preference, it was theological marketing. Churches competing for pilgrims needed awe-inspiring visuals, and nothing dazzled like ultramarine. The pigment became so sacred that contracts for religious artworks specified its use for Mary's robe alone, with cheaper azurite filling in less important areas. Royalty quickly adopted this celestial branding. Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, wore deep blue robes embroidered with golden fleurs de lis to project both piety and authority. His court's embrace of blue started a trend soon. The French royal coat of arms featured a blue background, and the term royal blue entered the lexicon. The color's prestige grew so potent that when the 1282 inventory of Westminster Abbey listed its treasures, ultramarine pigment was itemized alongside gold and jewels. What's fascinating is how blue's rise reveals medieval Europe's growing global connections. Unlike Tyrian purple or Kermes red, which came from the Mediterranean, ultramarine traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road. Its journey from Afghan mines to Persian markets, Venetian warehouses, and finally Parisian workshops mirrored the era's expanding horizons. When a king wore blue, he wasn't just displaying wealth, he was flaunting access to trade networks spanning continents. Yet blue's dominance wasn't just about geopolitics, it also marked a seismic shift in how people saw color itself. Ancient writers like Homer had described the sea as wine dark because they lacked a distinct concept of blue. By the late Middle Ages, blue had become so culturally central that it dominated cathedral windows, tapestries, and even the growing trend of heraldry. This transformation proves something profound. Color meanings aren't fixed. They evolve with technology, trade, and collective imagination. And as we'll soon see, no color embodied divine authority more strikingly than the radiant gold threads woven into medieval power. Gold thread in medieval Europe wasn't merely decorative, it was alchemy made visible, sunlight captured in textile form. Picture a king's coronation robe under flickering torchlight, every movement sending ripples of brilliance across the room. This wasn't just opulence, it was theater designed to stun observers into submission. The process of creating gold thread was almost mystical. Skilled artisans would hammer gold into thin foil, then painstakingly wind it around silk or linen cores, producing filaments so delicate that a single ounce could stretch for miles. When woven into fabric, these threads created patterns that seemed to move independently, as if animated by divine breath. The symbolism went deeper than mere dazzle. Gold's incorruptibility, its resistance to tarnish, made it the perfect metaphor for heavenly favor. Monarchs like Charlemagne and Henry VIII wore gold-embroidered mantles not just to impress, but to visually claim their rule was as eternal and untouchable as the metal itself. Religious vestments took this further. A 14th-century bishop's cope might feature thousands of gold thread stitches forming scenes of saints, each figure shimmering to suggest their celestial presence. These garments weren't worn, they were performed, transforming clergy into living icons during Mass. What's often overlooked is the global scramble behind this gilded splendor. Most medieval Europe had no local gold sources, so the metal traveled treacherous routes from West African mines across the Sahara on camel caravans, or from Byzantine treasuries guarded by Varangian mercenaries. The economic ripple effects were staggering. Historians estimate that the gold thread used for one royal cloak could feed a village for years, making its wearer a walking display of economic disparity. Yet gold's power wasn't just about scarcity, it was about transformation. Alchemists claimed aurum potabile, drinkable gold, could confer immortality, while physicians prescribed gold leaf for ailments. When nobles wore gold fabrics, they subtly hinted at these supernatural associations, positioning themselves between mortal and divine realms. Even the technique of cloth of gold, fabrics woven entirely with gold threads, had military uses. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold Summit in 1520, Henry VIII's pavilion of gilded fabric wasn't just a display of wealth. It was psychological warfare designed to overwhelm French rivals with sheer radiance. The true mastery lay in how gold thread played with light. Unlike flat dyes, metallic threads refracted illumination dynamically, making wearers appear to glow from within in candlelit halls. Tapestries like the Apocalypse of Angers used this effect strategically. Their gold-woven heavens literally outshone the darker earth tones below, reinforcing medieval cosmology visually. This interplay of material and metaphor made gold thread the ultimate propaganda tool, one that required no words to convey its message of unquestionable authority. But for all its celestial connotations, gold's brilliance had a dark underside. The same mines that supplied Europe's workshops relied on slave labor from Hungarian pits to Malian deserts. When a queen wore gold embroidery, she carried unseen suffering in every stitch. This paradox, divine symbolism built on human exploitation, mirrored the very hierarchies it upheld. And as we'll see next, another color would come to represent both the vitality and volatility of medieval power structures, one rooted in nature's relentless cycles. Green stood alone in the medieval palette, a color of paradoxes, where life and betrayal grew from the same stem. Unlike the unshakable authority of purple or the martial certainty of red, green whispered of shifting fortunes. Noble landowners draped themselves in emerald silks to flaunt their fertile estates, the fabric's lush hues echoing rolling fields and ancient forests they controlled. Yet that same color cloaked Judas in frescoes, his verdant robes a warning that even trusted hands could cultivate treachery. This tension wasn't accidental. It was woven into the very difficulty of producing green dye. Creating lasting green fabrics required an alchemist's patience. Most dyers resorted to layering first a bath of blue woad, then a glaze of yellow weld or saffron. But these hybrid hues often faded unevenly, leaving garments mottled like rotting leaves. The few reliable greens came from exotic sources, malachite ground into pigment for illuminated manuscripts, or verdigris scraped from copper plates left to corrode in vinegar. These unstable methods made consistent green fabrics as rare as they were expensive, adding to their mystique. When the Duc de Berry commissioned the Tres Riches Hures, his artists reserved vibrant greens exclusively for scenes of spring and youthful vitality, nature's fleeting perfection captured in costly pigments. Green's duality played out in startling ways across medieval Europe. Tournament knights might wear one sleeve green as a pledge of love echoing new growth, while the other remained undyed as a reminder of mortality. In heraldry, vert symbolized both joy and the unpredictability of battle. A knight bearing green on his shield promised either victory or caprice. Even the language reflected this split. Old French used verdure for flourishing landscapes, but verdure could mean both to green and to deceive. The color's most fascinating role emerged in medieval medicine. Physicians diagnosing lovesickness would place green crystals on a patient's chest, believing the hue could rebalance erratic passions. Meanwhile, apothecary jars storing poisonous remedies were often glazed green, a silent warning masked as natural abundance. This push and pull made green the ultimate social cipher. A countess's jade necklace might proclaim her fertility, while a merchant's wife wearing similar shades risked accusations of witchcraft. What makes medieval green so compelling is how closely it mirrored the era's relationship with nature, both revered and feared. Noble tapestries teemed with vibrant hunting scenes, their greens painstakingly woven to showcase man's dominion over the wild. Yet those same forests harbored outlaws and unrest, their shifting shadows a constant threat to order. Green didn't just represent nature, it embodied the medieval world's uneasy dance between control and chaos, a reminder that no power was ever truly evergreen. Now, another color waited in the wings, one that would transform from a mark of humility to the ultimate expression of disciplined authority, proving that even darkness could be polished into power. Black began its medieval journey as the color of penitence and poverty, the rough wool of monks' habits and the mourning garb of widows, but by the 15th century, something remarkable happened. This humble shade transformed into the ultimate symbol of disciplined authority, thanks to a revolution in dye technology. Early medieval black fabrics were actually just very dark browns or blues, achieved with iron-rich mixtures that often rotted the cloth. Then came the gallnut breakthrough, a method using tannin-rich oak galls mixed with iron salts that produced deep, lasting blacks without destroying fibers. Suddenly, black wasn't just possible, it was prestigious. No one understood this power better than Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. At his famous 1534 Feast of the Pheasant, he stunned Europe's nobility by appearing head to toe in black velvet, a move as radical then as a tech CEO wearing jeans to Wall Street today. His courtiers quickly followed suit, turning Burgundy into the epicenter of a fashion revolution. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Philip's monochrome wardrobe projected calculated austerity. While rivals dazzled in gold and scarlet, his black ensembles whispered, "I don't need flashy colors to prove my might." The message resonated. Soon, Spanish monarchs adopted the look, and black became the unofficial uniform of the rising bureaucratic class, men who ruled through ledgers rather than lances. What made black uniquely powerful was its chameleon-like symbolism. In daylight, it conveyed solemn authority, but by candlelight, those same garments shimmered with hidden depth. Portraits of nobility like Eleonora of Toledo show how artists exploited this duality. Their black satin gowns painted with such precision that viewers can almost hear the fabric rustle. The color's versatility extended to gender norms. While bright hues were increasingly gendered, black became the great equalizer, worn with equal gravitas by merchant princes like Cosimo de' Medici and formidable women like Isabella d'Este, whose black-on-black embroidered gowns displayed wealth through texture rather than color. The true genius of medieval black lay in its democratic illusion. Unlike Tyrian purple or ultramarine, the materials for black dye were widely available, yet achieving that perfect, even darkness required such skill that it remained elite. Dyers guarded their gallnut recipes like state secrets, and the multiple dye baths needed meant only the wealthy could afford truly black garments. This paradox, a color theoretically accessible to all, but in practice reserved for the powerful, made it the perfect tool for a new kind of status signaling. When a Florentine banker wore black, he wasn't just following fashion. He was demonstrating he could afford both the finest wool and the expert dyers to transform it. Black's ascent also reveals a broader medieval shift from external displays to internalized power. As courts became more sophisticated, overt displays of wealth gave way to subtler signals. A perfectly fitted black doublet required more tailoring skill than a gilded one, its elegance coming from cut rather than ornament. This transition marks the birth of what we now call power dressing, using restraint to command attention. By the time Henry VIII adopted black in his later portraits, the color had completed its journey from monkish humility to regal authority, paving the way for everything from Victorian mourning attire to modern business suits. Yet for all its solemn prestige, black carried an undercurrent of danger, something we'll see magnified in its supposed opposite, the seemingly innocent white garments that medieval rulers wielded with equal cunning. White fabric in the Middle Ages held a dangerous secret. The cleaner it looked, the more power it concealed. At first glance, those undyed linen tunics and woolen mantles seemed the very picture of humility, echoing the simplicity of saints and shepherds. But maintaining that spotless appearance required an army of laundresses scrubbing with expensive imported soap, beating fabrics on river stones, and painstakingly bleaching them in sunlight. What appeared as pious restraint was actually a flex. Only the ultra-wealthy could afford garments that looked this pure. The Plantagenet kings mastered this visual deception. When Henry II wore plain white robes during his feud with Thomas Becket, he wasn't just dressing modestly, he was staging a propaganda coup. The message was clear. Here stood a king so righteous he needed no finery, even as his knights plotted an archbishop's murder. White became the ultimate political camouflage, allowing rulers to cloak ruthless ambition in angelic imagery. Helena of Aquitaine took this further, wearing white during her rebellion against Henry, a calculated choice that framed her treason as holy crusade rather than naked power grab. Religious orders weaponized white's double meaning too. Cistercian monks chose unbleached wool for their habits to signal rejection of worldly vanity, yet their monasteries became economic powerhouses controlling vast wool trade networks. The whiter a monk's robe appeared, the more it whispered of unseen influence, every immaculate fold a testament to the order's reach. Even the Templars played this game, their white mantles symbolizing chastity while concealing banking operations that funded kings. What makes medieval white so compelling is the sheer labor behind its illusion. Before chemical bleaches, achieving true whiteness meant weeks of soaking fabrics in fermented urine or acidic whey, then spreading them on specially built, bleaching greens for months of sun exposure. The finest Holland linen from Flanders went through 16 separate washings before reaching aristocratic wardrobes. When a queen like Isabeau of Bavaria wore white silk, she wasn't just wearing a color. She was displaying control over an entire supply chain that stretched from Flemish weavers to Mediterranean alum mines. This color's true power lay in its chameleon-like ability to mean opposite things. Brides wore white to symbolize virginity, while the same shade adorned papal conclaves where cardinals schemed for the throne of St. Peter. Joan of Arc's white armor framed her as heaven-sent savior, yet years later, the Burgundians forced her into a white shift before burning her as a heretic, proving how easily the color could flip from sacred to sinister. No other hue carried such volatile potential, able to sanctify or condemn with the same blank slate. As we'll discover next, these symbolic colors rarely worked alone. The real art of medieval power dressing lay in combining hues like pieces on a chessboard, each move calculated to send messages only the elite could fully decipher. Heraldry transformed medieval colors into a visual language sharper than any sword. Picture a knight charging into battle. Before he lowered his lance, his coat of arms announced his identity, alliances, and even battlefield reputation through meticulously coded hues. These weren't arbitrary choices. Heraldic tinctures operated under rules as precise as legal statutes. Take the classic pairing of gold and black, known in heraldic terms as or and sable. This combination didn't just look striking, it proclaimed the bearer's wisdom and constancy, virtues critical for rulers navigating treacherous political landscapes. The de Bohun family emblazoned these colors across their shields, subtly asserting their reliability as power brokers during the Plantagenet era. What made heraldic colors revolutionary was their universality. A French knight might not understand an English noble's speech, but he could instantly read that family's red and white arms as signals of military prowess and purity of lineage. This chromatic shorthand extended beyond borders when Edward III quartered the gold lilies of France onto England's red field during the 100 Years' War. He wasn't just decorating, he was laying legal claim to a throne through pigment. The science behind these colors was equally calculated. Heraldic blues weren't just any blue, they had to be rendered in ultramarine or azurite to meet strict brilliance standards, ensuring visibility across smoke-filled battlefields. Families manipulated these color codes with Machiavellian cunning. The Habsburgs famously adopted a red and gold scheme not just for its regal connotations, but because those pigments survived sun exposure better than others. Their dynasty would literally outshine rivals in outdoor ceremonies. Meanwhile, the Visconti serpents of Milan coiled against a silver and blue background, colors chosen to mirror the treacherous alpine rivers they controlled. Even forbidden combinations held meaning. Green and purple placed side by side, called vert and purpure, in heraldic terms were considered taboo not for aesthetic reasons, but because they symbolized the unpredictable clash between earthly and divine authority. The true genius of heraldry lay in its adaptability. When Joan of Kent married the Black Prince, her arms were impaled with his, a visual merger showing their union extended beyond marriage to a strategic alliance of territories. Broken color patterns like chequy, a chessboard of two hues, indicated a family's role as mediators, while avare fur patterns in blue and white symbolized both wealth and diplomatic connections to distant cold weather fur traders. This system became so sophisticated that by the 1400s, heralds could identify a knight's exact branch of lineage just by subtle variations in color placement. A crimson bend sinister instead of dexter might denote a third son rather than the heir. Yet heraldry's real power emerged when these carefully constructed symbols left parchment and charged onto the battlefield, where colors didn't just represent lives, they saved or ended them. Battle banners weren't just fluttering fabric, they were the beating heart of medieval warfare, pulsing with color even as swords clashed and arrows darkened the sky. Picture the chaos of Agincourt in 1415. Mud-churned fields choked with armored men, war cries swallowed by the din of steel. In that swirling madness, a knight's only anchor was the vivid scarlet and gold of his lord's standard rising above the fray. These banners served as waypoints in the storm, their colors chosen not just for visibility but for the raw emotion they could ignite. When the Black Prince's silken standard, a field of azure studded with golden floors de lis waved forward at Poitiers, it wasn't merely signaling attack, it was unleashing centuries of royal legacy onto the battlefield. The science behind these war colors reveals startling sophistication. Banner makers didn't just grab any bright dyes, they selected hues based on atmospheric conditions. Crimson and gold dominated rainy battlefields because they remained visible through mist, while deep blues and greens stood out against summer foliage. Some commanders went further, incorporating metallic threads that caught sunlight like visual trumpets. The famous oriflamme of Saint Denis wasn't just red. Its silk was woven with actual gold, designed to flash like fire when the French king raised it, signaling no quarter would be given. This wasn't decoration, it was psychological warfare woven into every fiber. Losing a banner meant more than tactical disadvantage, it was existential crisis. During the Crusades, when Saladin's forces captured the Templars' black and white Beauseant banner at the Battle of Hattin, contemporary chroniclers described Christian knights fighting to the death not just for survival, but to prevent their sacred symbol from being desecrated. The reverse held equal power. Seizing an enemy's standard could break morale instantly. At the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, the Teutonic Order's entire formation collapsed when Polish knights captured their great white banner bearing the Black Eagle, a moment so pivotal it's immortalized in Machko's painting with the standard tumbling in slow-motion agony. What's often overlooked is how these battle colors bled into everyday life. Returning crusaders brought home captured Saracen banners as trophies, their Arabic calligraphy and geometric patterns sparking a fashion for Oriental motifs in European heraldry. The Red Cross on white field of St. George began as a Crusader emblem before becoming England's national symbol. Even the concept of colors representing military units traces back to this era. Medieval soldiers literally followed their regiment's colored banner, giving us expressions like "showing your true colors." The most fascinating battles weren't fought with steel, but with pigments. When Henry V ordered his heralds to display the quartered arms of England and France at Agincourt, he wasn't just asserting his claim. He was weaponizing color psychology to demoralize French knights who recognized those combined hues as a direct challenge to their king's legitimacy. Similarly, Scottish clans dyed their Bratach banners with woad not just for tradition, but because its eerie blue-green shade was rumored to frighten English horses. In an age before gunpowder smoke obscured everything, these chromatic signals turned battlefields into deadly chessboards where every move was painted in symbolic hues. Yet for all their battlefield importance, these banners were mere rehearsals for the grand chromatic performances awaiting in throne rooms, where colors didn't just accompany power, but architect it down to the last gilded tapestry nail. Stepping into a medieval throne room was like entering a living painting, one designed to stun the senses and humble the soul. Take the Palais de la Cité in Paris, where King Charles V received guests beneath a ceiling painted celestial blue and studded with golden fleurs de lis. The effect wasn't just decorative, it placed the monarch literally beneath heaven's vault, his earthly rule divinely sanctioned. Every hue in these spaces was calculated. Crimson tapestries lining the walls weren't merely rich, their kerms dyed wool-absorbed sound, creating a hushed atmosphere where even a whisper carried weight. Gilded thrones reflected candlelight strategically, ensuring the ruler's face remained illuminated while visitors stood in comparative shadow, a visual metaphor for enlightenment flowing from the crown. The psychology behind these color choices reveals meticulous planning. Westminster Hall's 1266 oak beams were originally painted vermilion, not just for grandeur, but because the pigment contained toxic mercury sulfide, subconsciously reinforcing that royal authority could be as deadly as it was dazzling. In the Alhambra, Nasrid sultans used intricate azulejo tiles in hypnotic blue and green geometric patterns to overwhelm Christian ambassadors, their repeating designs symbolizing the infinite nature of Islamic rule. Even flooring played a role. The red porphyry stones in Charlemagne's Aachen Chapel forced visitors to walk over the imperial color before approaching the throne, literally trampling on symbols of their own ambition. Color's architectural power peaked in the Vatican Stanza della Signatura, when Pope Julius II commissioned Raphael to fresco its walls. The artist used ultramarine blue, ground from lapis lazuli worth 3 times its weight in gold, exclusively for the figure of theology. This wasn't just artistic license. It created a visual hierarchy where divine wisdom literally outshone neighboring frescoes of philosophy and poetry in cheaper pigments. Similarly, the Sainte-Chapelle's stained glass transformed sunlight into sapphire and ruby beams that drenched French royalty in sacred light during ceremonies, merging their bodies with the colors of martyrdom and sanctity. But perhaps the most cunning use of palatial color came from Burgundy's dukes. Their Bruges palace featured a room entirely hung with black damask, a radical move that forced visitors' eyes to seek out the single source of color, the duke's golden chain of office gleaming against the void. This stark contrast made his authority the sole focal point in a sea of darkness, proving that sometimes the absence of color could speak loudest of all. These spaces weren't just buildings, they were carefully tuned instruments of persuasion, where every hue conspired to shape perception. From the golden mosaics of Byzantine throne rooms to the emerald green silk canopies over Mongol khans, color became architecture's silent herald, announcing power long before any words were spoken. And as we'll see next, no institution mastered this chromatic rhetoric better than the medieval church, where robes and rituals turned pigment into prayer. Ecclesiastical vestments transformed priests into living stained glass, every fold and hue vibrating with sacred meaning. When a bishop donned his chasuble for Mass, he wasn't just putting on a robe, he was stepping into a chromatic language older than the cathedrals themselves. Take the Lenten purple, a shade so somber it seemed to absorb the very light around it. This wasn't merely about mourning Christ's coming sacrifice. The dye itself carried theology. Unlike royal Tyrian purple, church violet was often diluted with cheaper pigments, visually echoing the humility expected during penitential seasons. Yet even this austerity had layers. Some dioceses used deeper hues for bishops, creating a visual hierarchy within the clergy that mirrored celestial orders. The most explosive statement came in red vestments reserved for Pentecost and martyr feasts. These weren't just any reds, they were intentionally saturated with kermes, the same insect dye that colored noble finery. The message was deliberate. The blood of martyrs held equal worth to royal blood. A 15th century Florentine painting shows St. Lawrence's deacon's robe in blistering scarlet as he faces the gridiron, his garments outshining the flames meant to consume him. This visual paradox, suffering rendered in luxurious hue, became the church's masterstroke. Even the poorest congregant could see divine victory woven into the very threads covering their priests. But the real power play lay in white, reserved for Easter and Christmas. Achieving true liturgical white required staggering effort. Linen bleached in alpine sunlight, silk smuggled from Byzantine workshops, pearls crushed into pigment for embroidery. When a pope processed in his white cope on Easter morning, the blinding radiance wasn't just symbolic, it was a calculated display of the church's global reach. Every thread whispered of trade networks stretching from English sheep pastures to Egyptian flax fields, all sanctified by ritual. The brilliance of ecclesiastical color coding lay in its adaptability. Local saints often got custom palettes. St. Blaise's feast day in Croatia saw bishops wear unique blue-green vestments echoing Adriatic waters, while Spanish churches honored St. James with crimson mimicking Moorish battle flags captured during the Reconquista. This flexibility let the church absorb regional loyalties while maintaining universal authority. Yet for all this celestial theater, trouble brewed in the merchant stalls outside cathedral doors. As Venetian dyers learned to mimic sacred hues with cheaper materials, the line between holy vestments and marketplace fabrics began to blur. A burgher's wife might now wear a kermes-dyed gown indistinguishable from a priest's stole, and that visual confusion struck at the very heart of medieval power structures. The stage was set for a collision between sacred symbolism and commercial ambition that would rewrite the rules of color forever. Merchants turned medieval Europe's color hierarchy upside down, and the nobility was furious. Picture a 15th century Venetian marketplace where a silk trader's wife strides past in a gown of kermes scarlet, its rich crimson hue mirroring the robes of countesses just a generation earlier. This wasn't just fashion, it was social warfare. The explosive growth of trade routes had filled merchant coffers with gold, and they began flaunting their wealth in the most provocative way possible, by draping themselves in colors legally reserved for aristocrats. In Florence, records show spice dealers commissioning portraits in ultramarine blue, a pigment once so sacred it was reserved for depictions of the Virgin Mary. The message was clear: money could now buy the visual language of power. Sumptuary laws cracked down with increasing desperation. A 1487 Nuremberg edict specifically banned merchants' wives from wearing sable fur or silk-lined sleeves, while Milan threatened fines for anyone below the rank of knight caught wearing gold thread. But enforcement was nearly impossible. Clever traders exploited loopholes lining cloaks with forbidden hues, using cheaper dyes that mimicked elite shades, or simply bribing inspectors. In Bruges, dyers developed dragon's blood red, a near-perfect imitation of kermes made from palm resin, allowing wealthy burghers to skirt the rules while nobles fumed. The color police fought back. Venetian officials were known to publicly slash offending garments with knives, but the tide was turning. What made this rebellion so explosive was its psychological impact. For centuries, colors had functioned as a visual caste system. You could glance at a stranger's robe and instantly know their place in the world. Now, that certainty was unraveling. A Genoese banker's wife in Tyrian purple-inspired violet wasn't just breaking the law. She was shattering the illusion of innate noble superiority. The church amplified the panic. A 1420 sermon from Paris raged against merchants who cloaked their pride in stolen hues, mimicking their betters like jackdaws in peacock feathers. Yet beneath the outrage lay an uncomfortable truth. Many nobles were secretly profiting from this very trade. The same Italian aristocrats who bemoaned color violations often owned shares in dye workshops or silk imports. When the Fugger banking family began wearing black, a color newly fashionable thanks to Burgundian dukes, they did so with fabrics supplied by noble-backed monopolies. This hypocrisy revealed the real stakes. Color wasn't just about maintaining tradition, it was about controlling lucrative industries. The merchant class's chromatic insurgency previewed a seismic shift. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance, sumptuary laws would crumble under pressure from a new idea that wealth, not birthright, should determine status. A tailor's ledger from Lyon tells the story. In 1480, 90% of his scarlet orders came from nobility. By 1520, merchants accounted for over half. This quiet revolution in dye vats and weaving rooms would eventually topple the medieval world's most visible hierarchy, proving that no fortress, not even one built of color symbolism, could withstand the siege of economic change. Now the story takes an unexpected turn eastward, where camel caravans carried pigments far more exotic than anything Europe's nobility could imagine. The camel caravans crossing the Silk Road carried more than spices and silks. They transported entire worlds of color that would redefine medieval Europe's visual imagination. Among their most precious cargo were cakes of indigo, compressed from the leaves of plants grown in the Indus Valley. When these blue blocks arrived in Venice or Bruges, dyers would ferment them in vats reeking like rotten eggs, unlocking a hue deeper than any woad could produce. This wasn't just a new pigment, it was a revolution wrapped in cloth. Suddenly, European artists could paint the Virgin Mary's robe with a blue so intense it seemed to swallow light, while merchants flaunted indigo doublets that outshone traditional woad blues in both brilliance and cost. The color's exotic origins, vaguely understood as coming from heathen lands beyond Jerusalem, only heightened its mystique, turning every indigo garment into a wearable trophy of global trade. Equally transformative was saffron yellow, painstakingly harvested from the stigmas of crocus flowers in Persia and Kashmir. A single pound required 75,000 hand-picked blossoms, making it worth its weight in silver. When medieval dyers dissolved these crimson threads in hot water, they produced a luminous golden yellow that seemed to carry sunlight within it. Kings like Richard II of England draped themselves in saffron-dyed linens during coronations, their robes radiating warmth like human gilding. But saffron's magic went beyond royalty. Irish Leyant tunics adopted the hue as a status symbol, while Venetian prostitutes were required to wear saffron veils as both advertisement and social marker. This single pigment became a chameleon of meaning, shifting its significance from sacred to scandalous depending on who wore it and where. Perhaps no import carried more symbolic baggage than Chinese vermilion. Unlike European reds derived from insects, this mercury-based pigment arrived as powdered cinnabar mined from Tibetan mountains. Its lethal chemistry, breathing its dust, could poison artisans, only amplified its allure. Medieval illuminators reserved it for depicting hellfire and demonic faces in manuscripts, while alchemists prized it as the key to synthesizing gold. When Marco Polo described the vermilion-painted halls of Kublai Khan's palace, he wasn't just recounting decoration, he was feeding Europe's hunger for visions of Oriental splendor. The color became shorthand for the exotic East, appearing on everything from Catalan maps to the shoes of Burgundian nobles who'd never set foot beyond Rhodes. These imported colors did more than expand palettes, they rewrote social codes. When a Florentine banker's wife wore an indigo gown, she wasn't just displaying wealth, she was claiming access to networks stretching beyond Christendom. The same hues that decorated Buddhist temple banners in Samarkand now trimmed the hems of French courtiers, creating an unspoken visual dialogue between worlds. Even the language reflected this fusion. The Old French word azur came from Arabic lazarwood, which itself traced back to the Persian name for lapis lazuli mines. Every time a noble uttered the word, they paid unconscious tribute to the global journeys behind their finery. Yet this exchange wasn't just about admiration, it was also about appropriation. Crusaders returning with Byzantine silks often ripped out their Greek or Arabic inscriptions, replacing them with Latin prayers while keeping the foreign dyes. The vibrant Saracen red, favored by English royalty, gained its name from Muslim dyers captured during wars, their skills exploited to produce the very colors that symbolized Christian triumph. These contradictions reveal the medieval world's uneasy relationship with the East, both coveting its treasures and demonizing their creators. The ultimate testament to these colors' power lies in their shadows. When the Black Death disrupted trade routes, European artists suddenly couldn't get their usual pigments. Manuscripts from the 1340s show saints' robes painted in muddy approximations of ultramarine, their blues mixed from inferior azurite or even ground glass. These desperate substitutions prove how thoroughly imported colors had become the lifeblood of medieval visual culture. Remove them, and the entire system faltered. What began as exotic curiosities had, by the late Middle Ages, become inseparable from European identity. The same indigo that once traveled in Arab merchants' saddlebags now dyed the uniforms of French royal officials. Saffron yellow, once so foreign it was rumored to come from dragon's blood, flavored Spanish paella and tinted German legal documents. This chromatic assimilation foreshadowed a profound truth, that no culture's palette remains pure, and even the most entrenched power structures could be reshaped, one dyed thread at a time. Now, we turn to another unexpected dimension of medieval color: how hues became entangled with evolving ideas about gender, shaping everything from infant swaddling to queen's political strategies. Medieval color codes defied everything we assume about gendered hues today. Forget pink for girls and blue for boys, those rigid rules wouldn't emerge for centuries. In illuminated manuscripts, the Christ child often appeared swaddled in rich red, a color linked to divinity and sacrifice, while the Virgin Mary's robes shifted from early dark tones to luminous blue as lapis lazuli became available. This wasn't just artistic license, it reflected a world where colors signaled spiritual roles rather than biological sex. Noble women like Elena of Aquitaine embraced azure gowns not because blue was feminine, but because its celestial associations elevated their piety and political clout. A queen in ultramarine wasn't dressing daintily, she was wrapping herself in the mantle of heavenly authority. The fluidity went deeper. Medieval tapestries show men and women alike wearing vibrant greens during spring festivals, celebrating renewal without gendered connotations. Chaucer's Wife of Bath famously wore scarlet hose, a bold choice that flaunted her wealth and independence, not her adherence to color norms. Even in childbirth, traditions blurred. Florentine families draped newborns in white linen regardless of gender, symbolizing purity, while Bavarian customs favored yellow swaddling for all infants, believed to ward off evil spirits. These practices reveal a startling truth: color's power lay in its context, not its connection to masculinity or femininity. What really unsettles modern expectations is how medieval society used color to undermine gender binaries altogether. Joan of Arc's refusal to wear women's dresses wasn't just about practicality. Her accusers fixated on her penchant for black and grey male attire as evidence of heresy. Conversely, the 14th century French chronicler Froissart described King Charles VI's brother Louis wearing pink satin at a joust, not as a statement of identity, but simply because it complemented his heraldic colors. This chromatic freedom extended to clergy too. Bishops wore rose-pink vestments on Gaudete Sunday, a tradition continuing today, while monks dyed their habits in earthy ochres and browns that defied gendered associations. The alchemy behind these colors reveals another layer of intrigue. Creating stable pink dyes required mixing expensive kermes red with bone white, a process so costly it became a status symbol for both sexes. Meanwhile, Persian blue, made from imported indigo, appeared in everything from night surcoats to merchant wives' head coverings. These shared palettes prove that prestige, not gender, dictated hue hierarchies. Even in heraldry, colors followed symbolic rules unrelated to biology. A lady's coat of arms might feature bold crimson just as her husband's displayed sky blue. This fluid system only hardened into modern gendered norms through commercial forces. 18th century European cloth manufacturers, seeking to boost sales, began marketing pink for boys as a watered-down red, symbolizing martial vigor, and blue for girls, linked to the virgin's purity. The medieval world would have found this absurd. Their color logic revolved around power, piety, and price tags, not arbitrary gender divides. When we see a medieval painting of St. George in flowing pink cape or a noblewoman commanding attention in gold-embroidered green, we're witnessing a lost chromatic world where colors weren't cages but currencies of meaning. Now the story twists toward the workshops where these transformative hues were born, places where chemistry and superstition colluded to create shades that could make or break reputations. The medieval dye workshop was a cauldron of alchemy where science and folklore bubbled together in toxic harmony. Behind the vibrant fabrics that dazzled courts and cathedrals lay processes so foul they were often banished to the outskirts of towns, not just for the smell, but to protect the dyer's monopoly on these arcane arts. Take the prized Tyrian purple. Workers would harvest thousands of rotting murex snails, their decaying flesh emitting a stench so potent that Roman writers claimed it could be smelled before the dye houses came into view. The liquid extracted from these mollusks started as a sickly yellow, then transformed through oxidation into that legendary royal purple. When exposed to sunlight, a metamorphosis so magical it seemed proof of divine intervention. Equally bizarre were the urine vats used across Europe to fix wool dyes. Guild regulations strictly controlled when and where these could be emptied. The 14th century Dyers' Ordinance of London prohibited dumping stale urine into the Thames during daylight hours to avoid public outrage. Workers would trample fabrics in foot-deep vats of fermented human waste, the ammonia acting as a mordant to bond color molecules to fibers. This wasn't just crude chemistry, it was precision work. Too little urine meant fading colors, while too much could dissolve the wool entirely. The best dyers guarded their fermentation times like state secrets, some insisting only the urine of red-headed men produced the proper chemical balance for scarlet dyes. The superstitions surrounding these processes reveal how deeply magic and science intertwined. Venetian dyers preparing kermes red would recite prayers to Saint Martha while stirring their vats, believing the dye's brilliance depended on both chemical ratios and divine favor. In Flanders, woad dyers buried their blue fabrics in special pits during the full moon, convinced lunar cycles affected color fastness. These rituals weren't mere tradition, they emerged from observable phenomena. A vat stirred counterclockwise might indeed produce inferior blues because oxygen distribution affected the reduction process. but medieval artisans explained it as angering the indigo demons. Perhaps no practice was more fraught than creating black, the ultimate test of a master dyer's skill. The gallnut method required harvesting oak apple galls formed by wasp larvae, then fermenting them with iron sulfate in a process so precise that many believed it required astrological alignment. Too much iron would rot the fabric, while too little left a muddy brown. The finest black velvets, like those worn by Burgundian dukes, underwent up to 20 dye baths over several months, each step timed to planetary movements according to guild records. These workshops became hotbeds of proto-scientific experimentation despite their mystical trappings. A Florentine dyer's manual from 1392 details how adding alum from Asia Minor could make yellows more vibrant, while Bohemian dyers discovered that adding crushed glass to vats created glittering fabrics, a technique later adapted for ceremonial vestments. The line between laboratory and alchemist's den blurred completely in pursuits like Dragon's Blood Red, where merchants knowingly sold resin from Malaysian rattan palms as actual dragon's blood to wealthy clients craving mythical colors. What emerges from these smelly, dangerous workshops is a paradox. The very processes that produced colors of divine radiance were earthily grotesque. That sacred ultramarine in a Virgin Mary painting began with lapis lazuli stones ground by convict laborers in Afghan mines. The golden sheen of a queen's gown came from lamb intestines scraped thin as spider silk to wrap around thread. This tension between the sublime and the visceral made medieval colors far more than visual spectacles. They were tangible proof of humanity's ability to wrest beauty from brutality. As these masterworks left the dye vats, another group of artisans stood ready to immortalize them not on fabric, but on parchment where their luminous secrets could be preserved for centuries. The Illuminator's studios awaited, their gold leaf and rare pigments poised to capture this chromatic alchemy in another form entirely. Illuminated manuscripts were more than just religious texts. They were jewel boxes of color symbolism, each page a miniature stage where medieval power dynamics played out in vibrant pigments. The Tres Riches Hues of the Dr. Berry didn't just depict biblical scenes. Its calendar pages showed the Duke's castles in lavish detail, their walls rendered in precious ultramarine while peasants toiled below in earthy browns and greens. This wasn't subtlety, it was visual propaganda where every hue reinforced the social order. Gold leaf, applied with breathless precision, didn't merely decorate letters. It transformed words into luminous objects, making scripture seem literally divine as light danced across the page. The logistics behind these colors reveal their true value. When a patron commissioned a manuscript, the contract often specified exact pigments: ultramarine for the Virgin's robe, vermilion for martyr's blood, real gold leaf for halos. One 1440 Florentine ledger lists payment for a Bible where the blue alone cost 30 florins, enough to buy a small vineyard. Artists would grind lapis lazuli between porphyry slabs for hours, creating a powder so precious they'd sweep the workspace with feather dusters to recover stray particles. The resulting blue was more than a color. It was crystallized wealth, a devotional act, and a status symbol all at once. What makes these manuscripts extraordinary is how they democratized elite color codes. While sumptuary laws restricted who could wear Tyrian purple, even modest parish churches could own a psalter where saints blazed in forbidden hues. A merchant unable to legally don scarlet might commission a book of hours with Kerm's red initials, carrying his defiance of noble privilege in parchment form. The church tolerated this because the message remained controlled. A peasant gazing at an illuminated Last Judgment saw damned souls in cheap green earth pigment while the blessed wore celestial blues, reinforcing the existing hierarchy even as it offered glimpses of otherwise inaccessible colors. The real magic happened in the scriptorium's alchemy. To create that radiant gold effect, illuminators would lay down sticky gesso, press paper thin gold leaf onto it, then burnish the surface with a wolf's tooth believed to give the deepest shine. Some artists added crushed sapphire to blue pigments for extra sparkle, while others mixed ground glass into reds to mimic the stained windows of cathedrals. These weren't just decorative tricks, they transformed flat pages into multidimensional experiences, where shifting light revealed hidden depths like sunlight through stained glass. Festivals took this chromatic theater to the streets, turning entire cities into living manuscripts. When Philip the Good entered Bruges in 1440, the route was lined with tapestries in his signature black and gold, while fountains ran with wine dyed crimson to mimic the blood of Burgundian martyrs. Participants wore carefully coded hues, guild members in their corporate colors, clergy in liturgical vestments, visiting nobles in carefully calibrated shades that signaled alliances without a word spoken. A single procession could contain more political nuance than a dozen diplomatic letters, all conveyed through strategic color placement. Jousts became particularly sophisticated in their chromatic messaging. Knights didn't just wear their coats of arms, they coordinated entire retinues in thematic hues. At the 1430 Field of the Cloth of Gold tournament, one contender dressed his squires in green and white striped hose while his pages wore solid green, creating a moving cascade of verdure that proclaimed his family's ties to fertile land. Even the horses played roles, their caparisons embroidered with allegorical scenes where colors held clues to the rider's political ambitions. These events weren't mere entertainment. They were competitive exhibitions of dying mastery and economic clout, where the depth of a velvet's crimson or the intensity of a silk's blue could make or break reputations. The true brilliance of medieval festivals lay in their impermanence. Unlike manuscripts that preserved colors for centuries, these live performances existed only in memory, their lavish pigments fading like twilight after the event. That fleeting quality made them even more precious, ensuring nobles would bankrupt themselves for another chance to dazzle the crowd. When the last trumpet sounded and the dyes washed away, what remained was the indelible impression of power, not in stone or law, but in the mind's eye, where those impossible blues and radiant golds continued to glow long after the festival gates closed. Festivals and tournaments didn't just celebrate medieval power, they weaponized color in ways that would put modern marketing campaigns to shame. Picture the streets of London in 1487, when Henry VII made his royal entry after the Wars of the Roses. The route wasn't just decorated, it was transformed into a chromatic chessboard. Silk drapes in Lancaster red and York white hung side by side, not as a sign of division, but to showcase the new Tudor rose emblem that merged both hues. Every guild member lining the streets wore livery colors signaling their trade, fishmongers in sea green, goldsmiths in predictably gold-trimmed azure. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a carefully orchestrated visual coup where the right shades could cement a shaky dynasty's legitimacy overnight. Jousts took this symbolism to dizzying heights. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold, knights didn't just compete in skill, they battled in bespoke color schemes designed to tell stories. One Burgundian competitor wore alternating black and yellow panels, the dark segments embroidered with tiny silver tears to commemorate his late wife, while the bright yellows proclaimed his readiness to rejoin life's golden light. Even the horses played part, their caparisons dyed in patterns so intricate that chroniclers described them as moving heraldic manuscripts. The real power move, some knights soaked their lance tips in colored wax. When they shattered against an opponent's shield, they left vivid splashes of blood in their house colors, turning every hit into a branding opportunity. The most cunning color schemes emerged in mock battles called tableaux vivants. During Philip the Good's Bruges festivities, actors reenacted the siege of Jerusalem with Saracens in deliberately faded greens, dyed with inferior woad to appear heathenish, while crusaders blazed in fresh kermes scarlet. The message was visceral. Christian hues literally outshone the enemy. These spectacles weren't just entertainment, they were dye-based propaganda, imprinting political narratives onto spectators' retinas through sheer chromatic overload. Yet for all their brilliance, these displays carried a built-in expiration date. The same vermilion banners that awed crowds on Monday would be sun-bleached to pink by Friday, their power literally fading before spectators' eyes. This impermanence was the whole point. Like Instagram stories of their day, these colors thrived on their fleeting nature, forcing nobles to constantly restage their magnificence at ruinous cost. When a Florentine banker's records show him renting instead of buying scarlet drapery for his daughter's wedding, we glimpse the economic strain behind the spectacle. The true legacy of these festival colors lies in their ghosts. Walk through modern London during a royal procession, and you'll still see flashes of medieval coding, the beefeaters' red tunics borrowed from Tudor guards, the gold coach trim echoing Plantagenet excess. Even our sports teams' color rivalries descend from jousting factions. These hues outlived the eras that created them because they spoke a primal language, one where visual shock could trump swords, and a perfectly chosen shade might just win a crown. The rigid world of medieval color symbolism didn't fade overnight. It unraveled thread by thread as Renaissance innovations and shifting social currents rewrote the rules of visual power. The first cracks appeared in the dye vats themselves. When Portuguese explorers opened sea routes to India in the 1500s, they flooded Europe with affordable indigo, undercutting the monopoly on precious ultramarine. Suddenly, that celestial blue once reserved for Virgin Mary paintings appeared in merchants' doublets and even servants' livery. Meanwhile, Spanish conquistadors brought back cochineal insects from the New World, tiny creatures that produced a scarlet dye 10 times stronger than traditional kermes. This devil's blood, as dyers called it, democratized red's fiery prestige, turning what was once a noble privilege into something even prosperous farmers could flaunt. Black's rise as the new power color perfectly captured this transitional era. Gone were the days when monarchs needed to blind subjects with gold to prove their might. Now, bureaucrats like Thomas Cromwell wore severe black robes to project disciplined authority. The shade's ascent mirrored the changing sources of influence, no longer birthright alone, but administrative skill and economic acumen. Portraits of 16th century bankers and lawyers show them in identical Inkai hues, their wealth evident not in colorful ostentation but in the quality of the wool's weave and the precision of their tailored sleeves. This was power dressing too, Zero, where restraint became the ultimate display of confidence. Yet the most profound shift wasn't in pigments but in perception. Humanist thinkers began questioning why a shellfish's accident of biology should determine social hierarchies. Erasmus mocked sumptuary laws as the arrogance of princes who legislate the rainbow, while Venetian satirists penned plays about tailors outwitting color inspectors. The medieval mindset, where hues were fixed symbols of divine order, collapsed under the weight of new ideas. When Elizabeth I wore silver and white instead of traditional royal gold to her coronation, she wasn't just making a fashion statement, she was declaring that meanings could be reinvented. The remnants of this color revolution linger all around us. Modern military uniforms still use blue and red for rank distinctions, a direct inheritance from medieval heraldry. Graduation robes parade medieval hierarchies in disguise. Oxford doctorates wear scarlet echoing cardinals' robes, while bachelors' black nods to the rising bureaucrats of the Renaissance. Even corporate branding plays with these ancient codes. Fast food chains use red and yellow for their appetite-stimulating energy, while luxury brands favor black and gold's timeless authority. Perhaps the most ironic survival is in children's clothing. Today's pink for girls and blue for boys norms actually reverse medieval traditions. Infant Jesus was often painted in red, while the Virgin's blue symbolized divine wisdom available to all. Our modern gender coding would have baffled a medieval parent, proving how fluid color meanings really are. From protest signs to sports jerseys, political campaigns to pandemic masking debates, we're still fighting battles with medieval color weapons. We've just forgotten most people can't read the visual language we're speaking. Walk into any modern courtroom and you'll witness a scene straight out of the Middle Ages. Judges draped in black robes that would make Philip the Good of Burgundy nod in approval. That's no accident. The legacy of medieval color symbolism pulses through our daily lives in ways we seldom notice. Academic regalia tell an 800-year-old story. Doctoral hoods lined with crimson echo cardinals' vestments, while Oxford's blue doctoral trim harks back to the Virgin Mary's ultramarine mantle. Even the humble graduation robe, with its black fabric and colorful trim, mirrors the monastic habits and noble livery of medieval Europe. These traditions aren't just quaint holdovers, they're a silent language of prestige that still commands respect. Corporate boardrooms have become the new throne rooms when it comes to chromatic power plays. Tech giants like Apple and Microsoft didn't choose minimalist white stores by accident. They're channeling the same aura of unattainable purity that medieval queens projected with their bleached linen gowns. Fast food chains weaponize red and yellow not just because they're eye-catching, but because these hues trigger primal responses forged in the Middle Ages. Red's urgency, once used for royal proclamations, now screams sale, while gold's association with divine approval legitimizes everything from credit cards to burger wrappers. The Tiffany blue box, that distinctive robin's egg shade, was specifically selected in 1845 because it mimicked the rare turquoise dyes Renaissance nobles used for love tokens. Political campaigns have turned heraldry into hashtags. Notice how conservative parties worldwide favor blue, not just any blue, but the same ultramarine tones that signaled loyalty and stability in medieval coats of arms. Progressive movements often adopt red, not merely for its vibrancy, but because it carries 8 centuries of revolutionary energy from peasant revolts to socialist banners. Even protest movements unconsciously mirror medieval color coding. The yellow vests in France echoed the golden hues of medieval tax collectors they were rebelling against, while environmentalists' green recalls both the fertile fields nobles controlled and the green men of medieval folklore who symbolized nature's resilience. The most fascinating survivals lurk in unexpected corners. Hospital scrubs follow the same color hierarchy as medieval guild surgeons in blue or green colors once reserved for elite practitioners, nurses in white the shade of monastic caregivers. Luxury brands still use purple packaging as subliminal shorthand for exclusivity, though today's dyes come from chemicals rather than sea snails. Even our digital world leans on this ancient vocabulary. The royal purple, used in app icons, taps directly into centuries of imperial association, while error messages flash scarlet like a cardinal's warning. These aren't mere coincidences, they're evidence of how deeply medieval color psychology is wired into our collective unconscious. When a bride wears white, she's not just following Victorian tradition, she's invoking the same symbolism of costly purity that medieval aristocrats flaunted. That little black dress hanging in every wardrobe, it owes its power to 15th century Burgundian dukes who proved darkness could outshine gold. Every time we react instinctively to a red stop sign or a blue uniform, we're obeying visual commands written in the dye vats and weaving rooms of the Middle Ages. Yet for all these enduring legacies, modern times have spawned plenty of misconceptions about medieval color use, myths that often reveal more about our own biases than historical reality. Hollywood would have you believe medieval peasants shuffled through life in muddy brown rags, while nobles pranced in exaggeratedly bright colors, but archaeology tells a different story entirely. Excavations from London to Lubeck reveal fabrics dyed in cheerful yellows from weld plants, soft greens from birch leaves, and even pinks from madder roots in commoners' graves. A 14th century cesspit in York yielded fragments of a working-class child's tunic in vibrant red, likely colored with cheaper but effective lichen dyes. This wasn't some monochrome dystopia. Even modest households prized color, using local plants and clever techniques to brighten their world within sumptuary law limits. The myth of universal drabness stems from a double illusion. Surviving tapestries and portraits showcase elite fashion, while time has faded many organic dyes archaeologists now detect with spectrometry. That brown medieval gown in a museum case might have started life as sunflower yellow or sage green before centuries of light exposure took their toll. Even peasant, undyed wool often contained natural pigments. Sheep's fleece comes in over 20 natural shades from silver gray to deep chocolate, selectively bred for subtle patterns. A shepherd's cloak might lack scarlet dye but still ripple with earthy tonal variations. Color rules had more exceptions than pop history admits. Sumptuary laws were violated so routinely that some cities employed robe inspectors, like 14th century Florence's official, who grumbled about merchants' wives hiding illegal silk linings under dull outer layers. Records show fines being paid with eye-rolling regularity, suggesting elites often turned a blind eye for bribes or favors. Even royal purple saw loopholes. Byzantine princesses could gift dyed silks to favorites, creating a gray market where the color circulated beyond palace walls. Modern recreations expose another layer of nuanced medieval color perception differed from ours. Without electric lights, hues interacted differently. That garish combination in a manuscript, say, pink and green, would have harmonized beautifully by candlelight as flame wavelengths softened certain tones. A noble's gold embroidery might actually be silver gilt thread, designed to shimmer coolly in northern light while appearing warm in southern climates. These weren't aesthetic mistakes but sophisticated adaptations to pre-industrial lighting. Interpreting these colors today requires peeling back cultural assumptions. When we see a painting of Judas in yellow, we think cowardice, but medieval viewers saw greed, the color of tarnished gold, that princess pink dress in a modern fairytale film. Its 15th century counterpart would more likely be deep blue or red, as pastel pinks were associated with youthful innocence regardless of gender. Even black's meaning flipped, from medieval humility to modern sophistication, proving color symbolism evolves with society. The real revelation lies in textiles preserved by sheer luck, like the Moorish silks found in a Spanish convent, their geometric patterns still vibrating with indigo and saffron after 7 centuries. Or the waterlogged wool caps from Brigham Wharf, their once bright greens and reds now muted but still hinting at a maritime culture that valued visibility in fog. These artifacts don't just correct the record, they reintroduce us to a medieval world that loved color as fiercely as we do, just on its own terms. Walking through a museum's medieval gallery today is like stepping into a carefully curated illusion. Those vivid tapestries and jewel-toned vestments aren't just artifacts, they're conversations between past and present. Take the Cloisters Museum in New York, where a 13th century chasuble shimmers with what appears to be royal purple. But lean closer and the truth emerges. Modern conservators used digital analysis to recreate the original dye, revealing it was once a far richer hue, faded by centuries of light. This isn't just restoration, it's detective work, peeling back layers of time to expose how power literally colored the medieval world. Filmmakers face an even trickier challenge. When the Lion in Winter dressed Elena of Aquitaine in icy blue, it wasn't arbitrary. That choice tapped into lapis lazuli's sacred associations, visually telegraphing her political cunning as divinely inspired. Contrast that with A Knight's Tale, where Heath Ledger's peasant turned. Night wears increasingly bold reds, mirroring the real historical journey of scarlet dye from noble monopoly to aspirational symbol. These aren't costumes, they're arguments about social mobility stitched in chromatic code. The real magic happens when you learn to spot the missteps. That Netflix series showing a 10th century queen in perfect black velvet, a dead giveaway. True medieval blacks were often more charcoal-toned until the 15th century's dyeing breakthroughs. Even prestigious museums sometimes get it wrong. A famous Swiss collection displayed a medieval emerald green gown for decades before spectroscopy revealed its dye contained 19th century chemical compounds. These inaccuracies matter because color was never just decoration. It was medieval Europe's operating system, with every shade a piece of living data. What separates casual viewing from true discovery is understanding the why behind these choices. The Victoria and Albert Museum's recent exhibition deliberately lit their tapestries in candlelight equivalent LEDs. Suddenly, those gold threads that seem garish under modern fluorescence transformed into flickering divine radiance, exactly as intended. Similarly, when the Met displayed Burgundian textiles alongside their modern replicas, visitors could finally grasp how nobles exploited subtle differences in sheen. A duke's matte black wool versus a merchant's slightly shiny imitation, to enforce hierarchy through texture as much as hue. This isn't just academic nitpicking. When we see a medieval film where crusaders wear pure white crosses, we miss the reality. Their actual tunics were often yellowish from cheap bleaching, a detail that would have signaled logistical struggles to contemporary viewers. Spotting these nuances turns entertainment into time travel. You're not just watching history, you're glimpsing how medieval people saw their own world. That's why institutions like the Musée de Cluny now offer color deciphering guides, helping visitors read exhibits like medieval insiders once did. The most fascinating revelations come from scientific tools. Multispectral imaging at Cambridge recently uncovered invisible color-coded stitch marks on a bishop's mitre, faded embroidery threads that originally formed a secret political motto in alternating red and gold. Meanwhile, Polish conservators used mass spectrometry to prove a royal blue Gutenberg Bible page actually contained smalt, a cheap cobalt glass substitute, proving even sacred objects sometimes cut corners. These discoveries blur the line between art and forensic science, proving every pigment tells two stories: what was meant to be seen and what was meant to be hidden. Why does this centuries-old color language still grip us? Perhaps because it speaks to something primal in how we process power. That gasp when you round a corner and see the unicorn tapestries in person isn't just about beauty. It's the shock of encountering a system where every thread carried weight, where meaning wasn't just worn but woven into existence. In an age of digital pixels and fast fashion, medieval colors remind us that hue was once literally worth dying for. Whether you were a snail harvested for purple, a dyer inhaling toxic fumes, or a merchant risking prison for the wrong shade of red. Their world may be gone, but its colors still pulse with life, waiting for anyone who learns to look beyond the surface. The colors of medieval power weren't just decoration, they were weapons, propaganda, and currency all rolled into one. Think about the last time you put on a black suit for a serious meeting or scrolled past a luxury brand's gold logo. Without realizing it, you were responding to visual cues forged in medieval dye workshops and throne rooms centuries ago. That deep purple in a university's ceremonial robes, a direct descendant of Byzantine emperors' exclusive Tyrian purple, the red carpet at high-profile events. It echoes the scarlet-drenched processions of Burgundian dukes. Even the white coats of doctors and scientists carry whispers of medieval purity symbolism, repurposed for a new era of authority. What's extraordinary is how these colors transcended their original contexts. Medieval blue, once so sacred it was reserved for the Virgin Mary's robes, now dominates corporate logos as a symbol of trust and stability. The black robes of judges, inspired by 15th-century bureaucrats, still project impartial authority in courtrooms worldwide. These hues outlasted the societies that created them because they tap into something primal about human psychology, our hardwired instinct to equate certain shades with power, sanctity, or danger. A modern politician's red tie or a celebrity's white gown at the Met Gala aren't fashion. Choices their unconscious invocations of medieval visual spells. But the most fascinating survivals lurk in unexpected places. Next time you see a sports team's colors, look closer. Football's Pittsburgh Steelers wear black and gold not by accident. Those were the heraldic colors of William Pitt, the city's namesake. The yellow and red of McDonald's, they're the same high-energy combo medieval heralds used to ensure visibility in battle. Even protest movements wield this ancient vocabulary. The yellow vests of France unintentionally mirrored the golden hues of tax collectors they rebelled against, while environmentalists' green banners recall both the fertile lands nobles controlled and the green men of medieval folklore who symbolized nature's resilience. This legacy isn't just about tradition, it's about the unbroken thread linking medieval minds to our modern world. When Instagram influencers pose in cobalt blue dresses for maximum engagement, they're exploiting the same celestial associations that made ultramarine priceless to medieval monks. The millennial pink trend, a diluted echo of the Kerm's dyed silks that once bankrupted noble families. Every time we react to a stop sign's red or a luxury brand's black packaging, we're obeying visual commands written in the dye vats and weaving rooms of the Middle Ages. So the next time you get dressed, ask yourself, what message are my colors sending? Whether it's power black, trustworthy blue, or rebellious red, you're not just wearing a shade, you're speaking a language centuries in the making. And if you've ever wondered why certain colors feel inherently royal, sacred, or dangerous, now you know. You're remembering what medieval Europeans worked so hard to make unforgettable. Drop your favorite color story in the comments. Is there a hue in your life with hidden historical roots? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell for more journeys into the secret codes of history. Until next time, keep seeing the world through color-tinted glasses. You'll be amazed what you start to notice.